Okay. Well, hello and welcome to the Extreme History Project lecture series. My name is Crystal Alegria, and I am the director of the Extreme History Project, which is a nonprofit that's located in Bozeman, Montana. And our mission is to make history relevant. And we do that in a lot of different ways. One way is through this lecture series, but we also do walking tours and bus tours. And most recently, we have started a podcast called The Dirt on the Past. So have a listen to that if you are a podcast listener. I have a few housekeeping tips before we begin. We are in webinar format, so you can hear us, but we can't hear you. So if you have questions, please write those in the question and answer box that you can access at the bottom of your screen. If you have thoughts and comments, you can use the chat button, also located at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the presentation, I will read the comments and the questions to Danielle, and she'll have a few minutes to answer those. For those of you in the Bozeman area, we are doing a cemetery walking tour on Halloween, October 31st at 4 p.m. called Spirits, Folklore, and Legend, a cemetery walking tour with our wonderful tour guide, Jessica Jones. So join us for a stroll through historic Sunset Hill Cemetery on All Hallows Eve, and step back in time as you walk through this historic graveyard, learning about mysterious local legends, spooky folklore, and local history. Keep watch because you may catch a glimpse of a spirit or two drifting through the headstones. Meet Jessica at the cemetery gates located at the south side of Lindley Park a few minutes before 4 o'clock. And tickets are limited, so please go ahead and buy your tickets soon. And Cheryl's going to put the link to our Eventbrite ticket page in the chat. So if you want to secure some tickets for that, go ahead and get those quickly. Thanks to everyone out there for your support of the Extreme History Project. If you enjoy this lecture series, our walking tours, our podcast, and all of our other programming, please consider becoming a member. It really helps us bring history to you in fun and engaging ways. Cheryl will put the link to the membership also in the chat box, or you can just go to our website and sign up. If you're here in Bozeman, just stop by the Extreme History Project headquarters, which is located on Mendenhall Street, 234 East Mendenhall, and say hello, and you can become a member there as well. So thank you so much for all your support. We really do truly appreciate it. I'm so excited to have Danielle with us tonight. Dr. Danielle Mead Skjelver is from Billings, Montana, but now lives in Bozeman. She is an associate professor of history with the University of Maryland Global Campus, which was founded to serve the American troops overseas. Her research interests include Fort Yellowstone, as well as Renaissance armies and the women who followed them. So interesting. Her current research focus is the early modern surge of interest in the question, what makes us human? She has produced scholarship on the intersection of gender, language, and power in the 16th century Europe. Among her publications is a translation of a Norwegian study on immigrants and the US-Dakota War, and she most recently has translated a 17th century French treaty on satyrs. So thank you so much, Danielle, for being with us tonight, and I will hand it over to you.
Well, thank you for having me, Crystal. This is super exciting. I got to go on one of your wonderful walking tours, and I can attest that the Sunset Hills Cemetery is quite the place. The ways people died are written on the headstones, which is sometimes terrifying. Right. Yeah. So I'm excited to be here. And before we begin, I should note that some of tonight's content might be a little objectionable to some listeners. I will mention reproductive organs, fecal matter, and violence where they are central. And I will be talking about birth defects, which can be a painful topic. This topic is pretty big, and I've packed a lot into our short time. I've had to trim some things that you might find interesting. So when we're done during the Q&A, if you would like to hear a bit about my work on mercenaries in the Renaissance, which is being used at museums in Austria, Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands, just let me know at the end. I'm not going to take time to introduce myself because Cheryl has done that, and you're here to hear about monsters, witches, and werewolves. About half our time tonight will go to monsters because they provide us with an intellectual framework for understanding witches and werewolves. Our period of exploration will be roughly the late 15th through the late 17th century. So roughly the years between 1500 and 1700. This era is called early modernity because there are differences from the medieval era. We have a printing press. We begin to see the scientific method emerge. Human rights and the best ways to govern become topics of scholarly discourse. These are just a few of the shifts that mark early modernity as different from the medieval period in Europe. Our region of focus will be Western Europe, which was overwhelmingly Christian at this point in time. And I will be making some assumptions about basic knowledge of Christian theology in the audience as we move forward. For example, I will assume that everyone here knows what the Protestant Reformation was and who Martin Luther was, and that he lived in the 16th century, that sort of thing. We're all in our homes or somewhere with the internet, so if you are at a loss at any point tonight, Wikipedia is actually a great source for basic definitions of terms and events. You might want to look up the English Civil War if that is unfamiliar, and just glance over the top paragraph. As we explore, as we explore monsters, witches, and werewolves, it might occur to some of you to wonder, how could people believe in such things? How could they imagine that these things were real? It all seems so absurd. How could anyone believe, for example, that a sure way to cure pneumonia was to drink blood from a cat's ear mixed in red wine? And that's not even witchcraft. That was a basic home remedy. These people were no less capable of reason than you and I. Some of them had studied natural philosophy, which was the precursor to modern science. So how could they think such ridiculous things? How could they believe such things so fervently that they would burn people alive to punish and root out acts like using magic to help someone find lost objects or to cure an illness? The purpose of studying the mysteries of cultures, these things that are so foreign, is to see the assumptions that are so taken for granted in a culture that they might not even be written down. These hidden assumptions might be quite foreign to us. And here we are blithely watching movies or reading novels where people in the past seem to think pretty much the way we do. They just think those thoughts in different clothes. It is in understanding the most alien aspects of a society that we can uncover the unspoken, the fears, the transgressions that could not be tolerated. And we can also see power. That power might be an assertion from the lowliest in society, the powerless, if you will. Or it might be the reassertion of control from those in authority who fear the loss of any power that they have. My work on tonight's topic began with my undergraduate work on Martin Luther when I stumbled across a surprising connection made by Heiko Oberman, the great Dutch historian. There was a moment when Luther had a revelation that Christians are justified by faith alone. That's sola fide for you Lutherans out there. It is the moment that one might see as an ember beginning to burn within him that would lead to the fire of the Reformation, or rather the conflagration of the Reformation, which was an extremely violent period of over a century and a half. This moment, the very origin of the Reformation, when Luther realized that he did not have to earn his salvation from a God that terrified him, this moment happened in the equivalent of an outhouse. He was, forgive the crudity, sitting on the pot. The location matters. The outhouse was believed to be the haunt of demons. So if God was willing to go into this place, this foul, filthy place where demons dwelled in order to reach Luther, then God could and would reach Luther anywhere. This was powerful and transformational comfort. People thought that demons liked to hang out in the loo because of the particular kind of stink associated with outhouses. Hell had long been thought to smell like sulfur, and sulfur smells like an outhouse, hence the belief that demons like to spend time there. Throughout tonight's exploration of things that may seem ludicrous, you will find that they made sense to people, just like demons in an outhouse. My doctoral research on the monstrous was closely tied to what people have believed about demons. I translated a 17th century French treatise on satyrs by Francois Hedelin, who is better known as the Abbé d'Aubignac, or just d'Aubignac for short. D'Aubignac's treatise was not illustrated because the depiction of anything unbecoming or confusedly arranged or profane had been banned by French authorities by the 17th century. And I could not find for our PowerPoint here any classical or Renaissance image of satyrs that was appropriate for a live broadcast. You can do an internet search on your own if you are interested, but be forewarned, they are not safe for work, as one might say. For our purposes, satyrs were half human, specifically male, and half goat. They behaved very badly. Given that much of our audience tonight is in Montana, I would imagine that quite a few of you are familiar with goats. They have lots of personality. The chief problem for d'Aubignac was that satyrs exhibited all the bad qualities of goats and of human excess: a lack of discipline, a total lack of decorum, drunkenness, loudness, lying, trickery, violence, and an obsession with sex. This probably would not have exercised d'Aubignac to the point where he felt he needed to write an entire treatise about them, except for one thing. Scholars were beginning to claim that satyrs were a kind of human. This is because since antiquity, the Greek and Roman heydays, people had speculated that satyrs might in fact be what we today call chimpanzees. Only a handful of Europeans had ever seen a chimpanzee. Those who had seen them in the wild would have seen them living in communities, working together to ward off attackers or would-be captors, throwing objects, using sticks and rocks as tools, grieving, laughing, and being really, really loud and boisterous. In other words, behaving a lot like the half-human, half-goat creatures they knew from lore. And if satyrs perhaps lived in communities, including maybe females and children, and if they spoke, and there were accounts of this, then perhaps they were rational creatures and really just a species of human that lived in the wild. This was not cool as far as d'Aubignac was concerned. It was an affront to himself and to God to include these foul creatures as he saw them with God's favorite creatures, which everyone knew were human beings. So he wrote his treatise to prove that satyrs were not and could not be men. He took their existence as a matter of fact. This surprised me, and I must admit I laughed because he was a very smart person. That satyrs existed was not in dispute. What was in dispute was precisely what they were. D'Aubignac argued that there were three possibilities. They could be apes, which would be chimpanzees, since great apes were not yet part of European knowledge. They could be monsters. That would mean human-goat hybrids, so the offspring of naughty goat herds. Or they could be demons. D'Aubignac believed that some were apes and some were monsters, but most were demons. And this makes sense, given that he was a budding theologian with a very deep classical library in which satyrs abounded as sources of confusion and terror and led people to worship the false god Dionysus, thus leading the souls of God's favorite creation to damnation. It makes sense that he would believe that there were indeed half-goat, half-human, half-goat hybrids. D'Aubignac's grandfather was the chief personal surgeon to 4 kings. He also wrote a widely respected book on surgery and a book on monsters, which is where this horse with a human head appears. You can see how growing up, leafing through his grandfather's book, his grandfather, who was an authoritative figure, widely respected across Europe, and the surgeon to 4 kings, d'Aubignac might be inclined to think about these things and probably not doubt their existence, since everyone around them took them for granted. One of the reasons people believe things that seem nutty to us is because authorities affirm them. Note the accompanying text here. This monster is both likely the product of some kind of sexual sin and a prophecy of sorts. As was often the case, the prophecy was only noticed after the fact. I'm not sure if you can read this. Crystal, can you tell me if you can read that? If not, I'll read it to you. Otherwise, I will move on.
I can read it. We can read it.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So the text here is an extension of the author's explanation of causes of monsters. The first cause, which is not seen here, is to make people marvel at God's wondrous power. In the world we are exploring, early modern Europe, there were three kinds of monsters. Monsters afar, these are monstrous races. So think in terms of cyclops, centaurs, and satyrs. These are the monsters of ancient Greece who live on through the 17th and into the 18th century. Monsters near, these are dwarves, elves, gnomes, fairies, and wild men. And teratological monsters. Teratology is the modern term for the study of birth defects. They were common in this period due partly to poor nutrition. For example, it was very difficult to get enough folate or folic acid, and people didn't even know that this was useful until the second half of the 20th century. A lack of folate can cause neural tube defects, such as anencephaly, which we will be discussing later. Teratological monsters were the most commonly reported and the most culturally important in periods of contested power. We will take a look at each of these kinds of monsters. But first, what are monsters? What does the word itself mean? As we know it, the word means an aberration, something far outside the norm. For Aristotle, anything deviating from the norm or from the ideal was monstrous.
Hello, everybody. It seems like Danielle has froze. I'm going to see what I can do to get her back here. Oh, hopefully she'll come back in. Hold tight. Danielle, we lost you. Do you want to?
I'm not sure what happened. Anyway, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I know where I was.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, if you want to share your screen again, because we lost your screen. So just share it once more and then we can just pick back up.
Okay.
Thanks everybody for hanging in there with us. Okay, here we go again.
Sorry about that. Okay. So what do monsters show? In medieval and early modern Europe, they showed God's messages. The belief at the time was that nature was like a book on which God wrote messages to his people. So in this book of nature, a red rose, for example, was a message to remind people of the passion of Christ. The red petals were to remind people of his blood, and the thorns represented sin, which pierced his brow in the crown of thorns. The belief was that roses had no thorns until sin entered the world. And here we get into Adam and Eve and the fall. And I don't want to digress too far, but original sin in the Garden of Eden was how people explained the presence of evil in the world, which was something people needed to explain if God was loving and all powerful. Human disobedience as a result of the temptation from the devil, who was himself monstrous as having revolted against God and having transformed from a beautiful creature of light, Lucifer, to, by the medieval era, a cloven-hoofed, horned, and charred figure who looked a lot like a satyr. God had given Satan a certain measure of license, so all evil, and there's much of that in what we're discussing tonight, that happened in the world happened only with God's permission. So if bad things happened to you, it was because God was testing you, or trying to make you a better person through adversity, or giving you the honor of suffering and sharing in some part of Christ's suffering, or more commonly, punishing you because you had done something to deserve it. Satan was, in effect, God's instrument. God was still in control, and this should comfort you if you are good and frighten you into reforming your ways if you are bad. One thing to keep in mind here is that goodness in the medieval mind did not mean what it means today. Goodness was abundance, not kindness. So the idea that God is good did not mean that God was kind. It meant that God was abundant. God was the creator. Monsters showed people clues about what God might do. For example, God might be about to bring famine or war. This was a pretty safe bet because bad harvests happened all the time. Agricultural technology and science were limited, and war and disease were the constant companions of Europeans in this period. Monsters that gave clues about the future were usually astronomical things like comets, but they also came in the form of unusual births, like the colt that we just saw. Usually these signs or clues were interpreted after the fact. In other words, there was a comet a couple of years ago which showed that God would bring about such and such particular calamity. We should have listened and corrected our ways, but we didn't. Monsters also showed God's wondrous power. They did this in the form of natural beauty and in the form of unusual formations like geodes. They also showed God's wondrous power in the abundant variety of species. Among the humanoid species were the monstrous races described in Pliny's Natural History from the 1st century of the Common Era. Pliny's monstrous races lived on in the European mind because they were believed to dwell just beyond the edges of the known world. Why would anyone doubt that they were there? Pliny's Natural History was still in use as a good source for understanding the natural world, and occasional reports of encountering these creatures would emerge from travelers. We cannot know whether travelers were embellishing or whether they actually saw something from a distance. Imagining became a certainty in their minds as they thought more and more about it. Neuroscientists are finding more and more that we often see what we expect to see.
Looks like Danielle has frozen again. I'll work to get her back. Hold tight.
Sorry, I will just reshare my screen. I do not know what is What's happening?
We're having a bad internet connection night, it seems like, but keep going. We'll
Okay.
just bear with it. There we go.
The source of my internet as well. So, okay.
Okay.
All right. So anyway, back to these guys. So I'll just skip ahead a little bit since we keep losing time to this. So you have the sciapod, which is, he uses his one giant foot as a sunshade. And then you have the one-eyed Cyclops, whom everyone knows from Homer's Odyssey in grade school. And then you have the Blemia, which has no head. Its face is on its chest. And then we have the Cynocephalus, the dog-headed person. Christopher Columbus recorded that his men heard reports of cynocephaly. Of course, he also thought that he could understand the language of the people he encountered in the Americas after only 3 weeks in country. Still, he was expecting cynocephaly. As the world grew smaller and smaller, and Europeans explored more and more of the world without actually encountering these creatures, the idea of monstrous races moved into outer space, living on as aliens. The stated function of monsters to show God's wondrous power was not the only function. These monsters also tell us what Europeans feared at the outer reaches of what they knew of the world. The Cynocephalus, for example, seemed very civilized, with excellent manners. They read books, discussed philosophy, played chess, and were in many ways the kind of being that Europeans found safe. But then they ate you. They were cannibals. So in the Cynocephalus, we see the fear of encountering human populations who might seem on the surface to be similar to Europeans, safely exhibiting the same values and customs until they didn't. And then it was too late. Also showing God's wondrous creative power were monsters closer to home. And I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. These were elves and gnomes, and they lived nearby. They might live in your barn, under the floorboards of your house. And these ancient beings from the pagan past were increasingly associated with the demonic and with danger as Europe became more and more Christianized. And the church tried to convert pagan ideas into demonic ideas. And we can see this as very subversive, but it was really quite overt. It was an attempt to save souls, as they believed. One monster to live on through a variety of iterations, even into today, is the wild man, which is essentially a feral human. Many societies around the world have wild man lore. In pagan Europe, they lived in forests, serving as protectors of the mountains and wilderness. And we see him being increasingly demonized. Merlin, we see this in the Merlin legend, Merlin from the Arthurian legends. Merlin lived for a time as a wild man. They were believed to have magical power and superhuman physical strength. There were also medieval romances where a maiden would capture a wild man and civilize him. I'm trying to skip ahead since I feel like I lost time with the Zoom crash. So in this image, which is a memento mori, a form of art that was intended to remind the viewer of death, the wild man represents a hidden danger to the unsuspecting woman at the high point in her life. She thinks he is her groom. She doesn't know who he is, that he is a wild man back there. And as Europeans colonized the Americas, some cast Native Americans as wild men in a romanticized manner. Eventually in the 20th century, the wild man would become Sasquatch. Most commonly, monsters showed what and who makes God angry. In general, this was monstrous behavior, which manifested itself on the bodies of newborn animals and human infants. These are teratological monsters, at the time called monstrous births. For example, here we have a pig-human hybrid, which is explained as the result of a human male pairing with a sow. Next to the image, I've transcribed the introductory language for the chapter on human-animal hybrids, where this pig appears. This was where behavior or beliefs defined as monstrous, as deviating from the norm, and as unacceptable, manifest in the physical body. So note how people who had beliefs contrary to the official doctrine, atheists, and people who engaged in sexual relations outside the heterosexual strictures, as well as outlaws, are conflated with people who engage in bestiality. There are whole books on such hybrids, and this half man, half pig monster shows us that bestiality was on the minds of a lot of people. That they believed that these creatures were actually born indicates that there was a real concern that people were messing around with farm animals. Something to note in this text is the excellency and divinity of humans. This refers to the great chain of being that ranked God's creation from the lowest life forms all the way up through the angels. This divinity of man was why D'Aubignac wrote his treatise to reinforce the line around humanity. As I mentioned earlier, it is in understanding the most alien aspects of a society that we can uncover the deepest fears, those transgressions that could not be tolerated, and we can see power. That power, in this case, would be the attempt of people fearing losing power, and we can see assertions of power by the powerless, in this case, women. I'm not going to explain the English Civil War because of the Zoom lapses and the loss of time. But during the English Civil War, we see many accounts of children born without heads. They have no head at all in the image reports, but it is more likely that these so-called headless children were actually children born with a birth defect called anencephaly. This is a birth defect where the child's skull is incomplete. The brain is often exposed and the face is sometimes only partially formed. These babies might live a few hours or minutes if they're born alive, and there was no sympathy for families who experienced such a crushing loss. Instead, there was blame. Parents were blamed for giving birth to children with extra limbs or incomplete limbs. And again, I'm skipping ahead here. Historians believe this interest in headless infants during the English Civil War was because the head of England was in constant question during this extremely violent conflict that pitted siblings against each other and tore towns and villages apart, with people forced to change sides or pretend to change sides, depending upon which army was occupying the area at the moment. On one side, the Roundheads or parliamentarians wanted Parliament, not the crown, to have primacy in governing the country. Most Roundheads were Protestant, specifically the reforming kind of Protestant that did not believe in infant baptism. On the other side, the Cavaliers or Royalists supported the monarchy and the Church of England, which did believe in infant baptism, touching the head. The English King, Charles I, was actually decapitated during this war. England was literally a country without a head, ruled as it was by Parliament and Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. So in the accounts of monstrous births during the English Civil War, we see much use made of the suffering mother, especially if there was gossip that she was known to seek more power than she was due as a woman, which was very little. So if she was outspoken or if she did not defer to her husband, this sort of thing would cause her to be turned into a poster, basically. During the English Civil War, the twin sins of not deferring to your husband and speaking out were all the more threatening because there was little control over people at all in England during this period of chaos and conflict. Religious sects abounded, including sects where women preached, among other things. It was a wild period where some people engaged openly and unashamedly in promiscuity, and some men and women rejected marriage altogether. Some formed communes where they shared everything, trying to live as the first Christians in the book of Acts. So this is really an attempt to completely restructure society and take power from those at the top. So women who had the misfortune to bear a baby with anencephaly were used as propaganda. As you can see in this broadsheet, she has said that she would rather have a child without a head than a round head, a reference to parliamentarians. On the royalist side, we see the same thing, only it is a woman who has rejected infant baptism. So she is a reformer, a supporter of Parliament and the Roundheads. Excuse me, if you can't read this during the Q&A, I can come back and read it to you. So the sign of a cross was a reference to infant baptism, which was a core tenet of the Church of England. And in all these situations, women have sought to remedy their powerlessness by declaring their own values, whether or not to baptize their children. They have not deferred to the heads that God has set above them, whether that be her husband, her pastor, her king, or men in general. One last item on monsters before we move on to witches. The Old English word for monster literally means border walker. A march, so this word here at the beginning, this is march. A march was a frontier, a boundary, and those who stepped or walked across boundaries were transgressors. Those who lived in such contested areas were outsiders, a potential threat. Just as monsters transgressed borders, occupying both the forbidden and allowed, witches occupied both the visible and invisible. Earlier, I mentioned that as Europe was Christianized, the church attempted to bring pagan practices and beliefs into line with Christian theology. They did this in part by emphasizing the apotropaic powers of the church. So this means the ability to infuse objects with power. So as pagans might have used ritual magic to endow a pendant, for example, with power to ward off evil or to protect a person from certain threats, often from witchcraft itself, the church would bless objects to serve the same purpose. They knew that people needed the ability to protect themselves somehow, and the church could provide that in a variety of ways. One of the most interesting and cozy ways was Candlemas, which was celebrated in the darkest time of the year. And the faithful would bring in candles, which would, the church would be filled with candles, as many as they could possibly bring in. And these candles would then be endowed with protective and healing power through the process of blessing and the performance of mass in their presence. People would break off pieces of wax as they left the church and keep the wax in their homes throughout the year to use whenever someone got sick or if they needed some kind of help. People would also take holy water from the church and use it in rituals at home. So in the Reformation and beyond, religious authorities in both the Protestant and Catholic camps became increasingly concerned that people were blurring the line between sanctioned doctrine and magic. Even so, people were rarely condemned to death for witchcraft in the medieval era. The church would try to bring someone back into the fold. They would try to correct them or teach them, and they might be sentenced or assigned a penance. It wasn't even a criminal act. They might be assigned a penance of something like living on bread and water for a year. Witchcraft made sense as an explanation for all sorts of things. Your cow stopped giving milk. Your husband might get sick. Your horse freaks out and kicks you for no apparent reason, or you yourself, a big strapping lad, faint. Your chimney falls down. You are suddenly infested with lice. Any of these things might cause you to seek out the very person you suspected of bewitching you. It was sometimes in the interest of people not to deny accusations of witchcraft. It was a skill believed to be passed down in families. And while if you were condemned, later your children or your siblings might also be condemned, it could also be a source of power. If people were not being persecuted as witches in your area at the moment, and if you were poor and generally without power, then you might not rebuff people who called you out as a witch, because they very well might apologize for potentially offending you and even give you gifts if they thought they had offended you and caused you to bewitch them. Sometimes a very powerful white witch or good witch, so to speak, could reverse a curse given by another witch, but most often it was only the person who had actually caused the curse who could reverse it. So witchcraft was a source of power for the powerless, and some servants were known to get their masters to be kinder to them if they could get their masters to fear them. But witches were prosecuted and persecuted, particularly after the publication of a book called the Malleus Maleficarum, meaning the hammer of witches. This manner for the interrogation of suspected witches transformed witchcraft from folk magic and knowledge of the medicinal properties of plants into a conspiratorial weapon of Satan, where all magic was satanic, involving a pact with Satan and worship that included eating human infants. It effectively created an army of witches to bring down God's kingdom. A new belief coming from this book was that women were so sex-starved that they entered into pacts with the devil so that he would satisfy their needs in exchange for serving him. Interrogation became sexualized as well. Women were stripped and their reproductive organs were poked with needles so fine that they could not feel them. The test was whether or not they could feel the sensation. If they felt the pricking, they were innocent. If not, guilty. Witch prickers was the actual term used for people who performed this test, and it had a double entendre then just as now. This was a form of power and sexual invasion of women, public shaming, and pleasure seeking on the part of interrogators. In this illustration, we see how Satan was worshipped or imagined to be worshipped. In these Sabbaths, which were an anti-church of sorts held in the wilds away from civilization, there were orgies with the devil and his demons, often in the form of goats and cats. So again, fears of bestiality, and the cooking and consumption of unbaptized human babies. Baptism offered some protection from witches, so parents were encouraged to baptize their children as soon as possible. People confessed to these things, and we expect people to say bizarre things under torture in order to get the torture to stop. But people confessed sometimes without torture or even the threat of torture. When you open the Hammer of Witches, you will find the most bizarre facts about witches, things that people, mostly women, had confessed to. Women would sometimes go to their pastor or priest voluntarily because they were concerned that they were flying away in their sleep and participating in Sabbaths. They confessed to a variety of sins that threatened men's sexuality, often stealing their penises. They would keep these penises alive in birds' nests by feeding them grain. Men would also confirm this belief by going to their local priest or pastor and telling him that their manhood was gone or that it had disappeared for a time and had returned. This is utter nonsense to us. How could people believe these things? Lorraine Daston and Catherine Park have argued that cultural constructs are as real as bricks. So beliefs or values, systems, ways of explaining why the world is the way it is. These constructs, these bricks, so to speak, serve as foundations. They build walls and they become the certainties on which power rests. If all your life, your explanation for the inexplicable was supernatural, and if people perhaps in your own family had been cursed or had practiced witchcraft in some form, why wouldn't you believe these things? Especially once they were in print. The act of seeing something in writing gives it authority in the human mind. As to actually believing that part of your body was missing or becoming suddenly ill at someone's touch, there's a lot we don't know about the human brain even now. Its power to shape our perception of reality is still being explored, and we do not know its limits. Nadine Dijkstra, who is a cognitive neuroscientist, writes, quote, "Reality and imagination are completely intermixed in our brain, which means that the separation between our inner world and the outside world is not as clear as we might like to think." End quote. Before we move on to werewolves, and I know I'm really running up against time, I want to spend a moment on the fascinating phenomenon of convent possession caused by male witches, which spread across France in the 17th century. At the source of this possession was generally a priest who was resented by someone in power at the convent. Witchcraft accusations often conveniently settled scores and allowed accusers to get revenge for some slight or injustice. In the case of one convent in Loudun, France, there was a famously handsome priest by the name of Grandier, who was something of a philanderer. He had seduced a high-ranking, unmarried young woman who found herself pregnant. He managed to get out of that scrape, but he soon found himself the object of the affections of several nuns in the convent at Loudun, including the prioress, Jeanne des Anges, and he does not seem to have returned their affections. These women accused this priest of coming to them as a specter at night in their dreams, seducing them and possessing them. The nuns publicly experienced convulsions and contortions in their sufferings as possessed. They behaved quite lewdly and shouted expletives, suggesting things and suggestive things when exorcists tried to break their possession caused by this handsome priest. The willingness of the prioress to allow public viewing of her and her nuns' suffering drew crowds from all over France. They also drew the attention of the powerful Cardinal Richelieu, whom the priest at the center of this possession had slighted some years earlier. Grandier, the priest, was subject to witch pricking, which I mentioned earlier, although we do not know if this was public, and 72 witnesses attested to his witchcraft, including his attending a Sabbath. He was found guilty of sorcery, was tortured and burned at the stake. The prioress, Jeanne des Anges, became famous and was sought out for the rest of her life for her healing powers. As I've mentioned before, we're going to move on to werewolves here, and I was going to talk a little bit about wolves in general, but I don't have time. I will say very quickly that wolves were much more prolific in the medieval and early modern world. In early modern Paris, in the days before street lighting, wolves roamed the streets at night. Here we have a woodcut of a werewolf attack. And the idea of humans transforming physically into animals is an old one. And it was not always bad. Think of the Swan Lake Ballet. But people turning into wolves was in fact bad. I'm just going to skip ahead to this particular account. This is a famous account of Peter Stump, who was a prosperous farmer in a war-torn region of Germany and an accused werewolf who was executed in 1589. In his town, there was a spate of unexplained deaths, and with them came the gossip of a wolf-like creature roaming in the area. I'm going to keep moving ahead here. So his mistress was also executed with him, and Stump confessed under torture to an incestuous relationship with his daughter. So she too was executed with him. If we follow the illustration from the top left, we see Stump as a wolf. A man has cut one of his paws off, and throughout the scenes, Stump, the man missing the hand that matches the wolf paw, it's matching. So this was actually a common way to try to see who was a witch. If you thought there might be a witch in town, one way to find out who it was to break the leg of a cat, whom you thought might actually be a witch who had transformed herself into a cat. And then the next day, if someone in town had a broken arm or a leg, well, you knew you had a witch. We can see Stump attacking a wolf, or Stump as a wolf attacking a child. And his execution is depicted in detail, including tearing the flesh with hot tongs and breaking on the wheel. And I will just skip ahead here really quickly to note that the sphere of werewolves was particularly strident. People were executed for it as much as for witchcraft, and including boys as young as 7 years old. I would note that in Stump's case, his trial and execution also allowed authorities to affirm their rejection of incest, which in a time when many people shared a bed, often whole families slept in a single bed, sexual contact, whether consensual or not, between family members was common, and this was monstrous, and Stump's execution was a way to reject this. Throughout our journey into the past tonight, I hope I've offered some insight as to how people could believe things that we today find outlandish. In recent decades, neuroscientists like Robert Sapolsky and Nadine Dijkstra have begun to shed light on the biology behind why we do what we do. I encourage you to check out their work, particularly Robert Sapolsky's Behave, the Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. One quick example, something as unremarkable as holding a cup of warm water will cause us to perceive other people as more kind than if we are holding a cup of cold water. Nadine Dijkstra has found that we bring our expectations to our physical surroundings, hence her claim here. As we've seen, early modern Europeans' conception of the world was very different from ours. They might well ask how we could not believe in magic and demons and monstrous species. These ways of explaining why things were the way they were embedded so deeply in their worldview that they did not even know they were assumptions, like that witches have real power and that God writes messages on nature and writes on the bodies of people. This assumption lives on into the early 20th century with phrenology and craniology, where people, serious scholarly people, thought that you could determine personality and tendencies, and particularly criminal tendencies, by observing the shape of a person's skull. These ideas justified imperialism and slavery in the 19th century and supported the pseudoscience that would culminate in Nazi racial theory and the Holocaust. They were also justified they were also used to justify Jim Crow laws and social practices applying to those in the United States who were not of Western European descent. So while we do not share many of the more damaging assumptions held by early modern Europeans, we do have assumptions that harm people. All cultures do. And we don't even know they're there until something bumps up against them and challenges them. So we should actively be looking for these foundational ideas in ourselves and asking, can we do better? So I'm sorry I went over. Now I will take your questions.
Thank you so much, Danielle. That was wonderful, fascinating. So if anyone has questions, you can write it in the question and answer box, and I will read those for Danielle so it's easy for her to answer.
I see Susan's comment there, the monsters are getting back. That's absolutely
yeah.
right.
I know, the gremlins were about tonight.
It's Linda's gremlins. Linda and I work together. She's a professor, a retired professor from UMGC. So
that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Great. Yeah. Yep. So I have a question to start off while we wait for others to put their questions in the question and answer box. So I never realized that people that were thought were werewolves were persecuted like witches were persecuted. What was their percentages of those thought to be werewolves versus witches in the persecution?
That's a really good
or generally, yeah.
Yeah, it's really hard to have numbers. In this period, we really only have the accounts of people who were very proud of the work they were doing in burning people or hanging them. They hanged witches in England and in New England as well, rather than burning them. And so we have those accounts of I hanged 19 witches today. I hanged, or we burned 100 witches over this period. We really don't know. For werewolves in particular, in Eastern Europe and in Russia, this was more common than in, or it was more common for men also to be persecuted as witches in Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, with that weird exception of the nuns, the convents, men were not usually prosecuted. Some were, and I'm sorry for being so vague with the numbers. There's really no way to know. But in this one period in France, with this particular inquisitor, Pierre de l'Ancre, he claims to have burned hundreds and hundreds of people, and many were werewolves. Yeah, so okay. I'm sorry, I can't be more specific.
No, that's okay. That's okay. Let's see. Anyone else have any questions? No one's asking any questions tonight. You must have answered all our questions, Danielle. This is recorded, and so someone did ask a question about if it's recorded, and it is recorded. If you missed the first part, you can catch the rest of it. It will be on our Extreme History YouTube page probably by tomorrow afternoon. So you'll be able to find it there. We have a comment. That message about the monsters tickled me. Were there many male witches other than sexuality, race, or whatnot? What would you lead people to think they were witches?
Well, first, hi, Katrina. This is my dear friend.
Oh, wonderful.
We're in a writers group together.
Right.
So no, there were not many male witches. Although I don't want to say more than I actually remember. There were witches who were there. There was a group of men in England in about this period, high-ranking men who were. This is, I think, after the Civil War, who were condemned as witches. And it's funny because, you see as people like religious authorities consulting astrologers. And I always wondered why that was okay. And men would be astrologers, why that was okay. But other forms of trying to figure out the future were not. And the reason was this whole book of nature idea that God was writing on the stars, and he had messages for you in the stars, and he would tell you when the best time for a coronation was, or when the best time to get married was. So that's why astrology was okay. And that would have been an area where men were active, but it was fine. Sexuality, race, what would lead people to think they're witches? Definitely sexuality, because of any homosexual behavior, men or women, was seen as something to be punished by death, and often associated with witchcraft. I'm trying to think what else. Just if you were not liked, and it was not always, these older women. It was not always marginalized women. Sometimes it was young women who just made the mistake of getting in the way of the wrong person.
We have another question from Charlene. How does the Halloween witch phenomena fit into the historical framework?
Whoops, sorry. I lost my spot there. That's a good question. So Halloween is an old Celtic celebration. It comes from Samhain, and the church tried to fix this the way they fixed, I'm using that word, generously, Easter, or which was a fertility rite. And they tried to fix it with All Hallows Eve, and it wasn't very successful. People continued to dress up as ghosts and goblins and scare people because it's fun. As to witches, I'm really not sure. Because that's not something you would have celebrated in the early modern period. You would not have wanted to be associated with that, except, of course, before there were persecutions, where as I was saying, it could be a source of power, to make people fear you. I almost feel like, but I don't know, that this is a more like a 20th century American thing, but it's just a suspicion. I don't know.
Okay. So what stopped the burning of witches? Helen asks.
So in the Enlightenment, more and more, so the Enlightenment is this beginning to see the world scientifically. And so it all ties together with monsters, where instead of interpreting a birth defect as a message from God, Francis Bacon just starts to collect them. He wants to have all of the examples of birth defects he can find, so that he can see what's normal and what's a deviation from normal, so that we can understand the human body. It's not about God necessarily anymore. And so with that kind of thinking, and people starting to think, spectral evidence, where my specter, sorry, my screen just went black, where my specter, let's say somebody thinks I'm a witch, my specter appears to you, Crystal, and you say, oh, Danielle's specter is here and confessing to murdering 5 people. I could be convicted for that, in say 1650. But in say 1690, that's very unusual. It happens in Salem, Massachusetts, but people are really starting to contest this. They're starting to think more scientifically, like this isn't, not that witches aren't real, but maybe that witches don't have the power that we think they have. That is when we start to see people changing their views about witches again, so that they're not really this threat. It's more of these poor people we can feel sorry for because they're so deluded that they think they have this power that they don't have. So what causes the change is a change in thinking to a more, it's hard to say rational because it's not really irrational to explain the unexplainable with something like witches if you don't have another explanation, like a microbe is causing you to be sick.
Right.
I'm not sure I answered that question, but.
I think you did. When was alchemy considered witchcraft?
That was, again, walking a fine line. And again, because it was men, that would be an area where they would be the ones, if it was considered witchcraft, and it really depended, then that would be an example of where they could be convicted. But for the most part, it was certainly in the medieval world, it was not magic. It kind of, because you're dealing with trying to make a substance change what it is. People thought that maggots, for example, so they thought that you could create maggots by covering horse dung, and that they would spontaneously appear. They didn't realize that the eggs are already in there. So in trying to change one metal into another, it's really the same sort of thing as this kind of attempt at science. So it could be seen as a cult, and sometimes it was, but not definitively.
Okay. All right. One more question. What do you think the satyrs might have been? If we see what we expect to believe, are we soon to find the bones of human-headed goats out there? Also from your friend.
Yes. That's a great question. So I'm thinking they were probably chimpanzees. That's what I think. But I don't know, because what about centaurs and what about cyclops? And it's not like these things only happen in Europe. I wish I knew more about the monsters of other parts of the world. Some of them have a root in the physical world, and some of them really don't. They're the imaginings of nightmares.
All right. Well, that's the end of our questions. So thank you so much, Danielle. That was a wonderful presentation. And thanks to everyone out there for joining us tonight, and hope you can join us again in the future for another lecture. Thanks, Danielle.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.
Too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.